For years, Bigfoot stalked my cabin, and I did nothing. But one night I turned on my camera, and the Sasquatch finally spoke, laying out information I was never meant to hear. My camera kept rolling while I captured proof that Bigfoot is real and that he exposed his true self without him knowing. I heard the first knock on a Tuesday night in late September 2013, and I knew immediately it wasn't a branch falling or a deer moving through the underbrush. I moved to the window, keeping the lights behind me dim, and I stared out into the darkness. I'd lived alone in this cabin for nearly 3 years since retiring from photography work that had taken me all over the country, and I'd grown accustomed to the sounds of the forest, the way animals moved and called to each other. But this felt different in a way I couldn't articulate even to myself. The knocking came again an hour later, closer this time, and I could hear the movement of something large pushing through the undergrowth. I turned off all the lights inside the cabin and stood in the darkness near the window. I could see movement at the tree line, something tall and broad that stayed just inside the shadows where the forest began. What kind of presence announces itself but refuses to cross the line into light? It didn't approach the cabin, and it didn't make any aggressive movements or sounds, but I could feel its attention focused on the structure where I stood. The shape remained motionless for what felt like an hour, and I remained equally still. Eventually, the shape withdrew deeper into the forest, and I heard the careful movement of its retreat. I didn't sleep that night, and when dawn finally broke over the mountains and light filtered through the cabin windows, I made a decision that felt both irrational and completely necessary. I prepared a plate of food, simple things like bread and cheese, and some leftover chicken from the night before, and I carried it outside to the edge of the clearing. I retreated back to the cabin, watching from the window. The plate remained untouched throughout the morning, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire encounter, if isolation had finally started affecting my perception in ways I hadn't anticipated. But when I checked again in the early afternoon, the food was gone and the plate had been moved. It hadn't been knocked over or dragged away by scavengers, but instead sat upright on the same rock, positioned carefully as if someone had picked it up, emptied it, and then replaced it with deliberate precision. The plate was completely clean, not a crumb or smear remaining, and the surrounding area showed no signs of disturbance except for a single impression in the soft earth near the rock. The impression was enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot and shaped like a human footprint, but broader and with toes that spread wider than any person's would. I crouched down to examine it more closely, running my fingers along the edge where the weight had pressed deepest into the soil, and I felt a mixture of fear and fascination. I'd heard stories, of course. Everyone who spent time in remote wilderness areas had heard the tales and the speculation of Bigfoot, but I'd never given them serious consideration because my work had always focused on documented wildlife. If I'd spent my life chasing proof, what did it mean that proof had come to me instead? I continued the food offerings every morning, placing the plate in the same location and retreating to watch from the cabin. And every time the pattern repeated itself, with the food disappearing overnight and the plate being returned clean and upright. On the 9th night, I saw Bigfoot clearly for the first time, though the Sasquatch remained partially obscured by the shadows between the trees. He was massive, standing at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, and he moved with a fluid grace that contradicted his size. He approached the rock where I'd left the food, moving in a crouch that brought him lower to the ground, and he paused frequently to look toward the cabin where I sat motionless on the porch. His eyes caught the faint light from the cabin windows, reflecting it back in a way that reminded me of a dog's eyes at night. But the intelligence behind that reflection was unmistakable and entirely different from any animal I'd ever photographed. Bigfoot reached the food and picked up the plate with both hands, holding it carefully as he examined the contents, and I could see the dexterity in his fingers as he selected pieces and brought them to his mouth. He ate slowly, and he never took his attention completely away from the cabin. When he finished, he set the plate back down with the same careful precision I'd observed before, and then he retreated into the forest. This pattern continued for weeks, and gradually the distance between us decreased as his comfort levels seemed to increase. He began approaching while I was still visible on the porch, no longer waiting for me to go inside, and sometimes he would pause in his retreat to look back at me, his posture suggesting curiosity rather than fear or aggression. I started speaking to him softly during these encounters, nothing specific or meaningful, just the sound of my voice offered as another form of communication. And I noticed that he would tilt his head slightly when I spoke, as if processing the sounds and trying to understand their purpose. If he was learning my voice, what else was he learning about me? Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that transformed the forest into a landscape of white and shadow, and I worried that Bigfoot might migrate away, or that the harsh conditions would end our strange relationship. But he continued to come, his visits marked by tracks in the fresh snow that led from the deep forest to the clearing and back again, and I increased the amount of food I offered, adding more protein and fat to help him maintain his body heat through the cold months. His fur grew thicker and darker, and I could see the physical changes in him as he adapted to the season, his body becoming even more massive as he built up reserves against the scarcity of winter. One morning in late December, I found the first gift waiting near the cabin door. It was an antler, a large one from what must have been a mature elk, but the points had been deliberately dulled, filed or rubbed down until they were smooth and incapable of causing injury. I picked it up and examined it carefully, understanding immediately that this wasn't something he'd simply found and dropped randomly, but rather an object Bigfoot had modified and placed with intention. I carried it inside and set it on the table, and that evening when I placed the food offering, I added an extra portion and arranged it more carefully than usual, trying to communicate my appreciation through the only means available to us. The gifts continued sporadically over the following months, each one demonstrating thought and consideration that went far beyond simple animal behavior. Bigfoot brought me fruit that didn't grow anywhere in the immediate area, varieties that must have come from miles away in lower elevations where the climate was milder. He left bundles of medicinal plants that I recognized from my years of wilderness photography, plants that had specific healing properties and were traditionally used by indigenous peoples in the region. Most remarkably, he returned items I'd lost during hikes in the surrounding mountains. A water bottle I'd dropped near a stream 3 miles north, a lens cap that had fallen from my camera bag on a ridge to the east. Objects that proved he'd been aware of my movements far beyond the immediate area of the cabin. Spring arrived with the usual explosion of life and color, and I noticed changes in Bigfoot's behavior that suggested a deepening of whatever relationship we'd developed. He began waiting openly near the tree line when I emerged in the mornings, no longer hiding or maintaining complete concealment. And sometimes he would mimic my movements, raising his hand when I raised mine, tilting his head when I tilted mine, as if testing the boundaries of communication through gesture and imitation. We never touched, and I never attempted to approach him beyond the invisible boundary that seemed to exist between the cabin clearing and the forest edge. But the connection between us felt tangible and real in ways I couldn't explain to anyone, even if I'd wanted to. What happens when a boundary exists only because both sides choose to respect it? I noticed Bigfoot's reactions to certain sounds, particularly those that originated from human activity in the distant valleys below the mountain. When helicopters passed overhead, even miles away, he would freeze completely and then disappear into the forest with a speed that seemed impossible for something his size. Distant gunshots during hunting season produced the same response, and I began to understand that his relationship with me was an exception to a much deeper fear and avoidance of human contact. He associated humans with danger, with threats that required immediate retreat and concealment, and I represented something different only because of the time and consistency I'd invested in proving myself non-threatening. One morning in early summer, I made a decision that I'd been considering for months, and I brought my old camera out onto the porch, setting it on the railing where it would be visible but not immediately threatening. Bigfoot arrived for the morning food offering and stopped abruptly when he saw the camera, his entire body tensing in a way I'd never observed before. He stared at it for a long moment, and then he looked at me with an expression that seemed to combine confusion and betrayal, and I realized immediately that I'd made a serious mistake in introducing this element without preparation. Bigfoot didn't approach the food that morning, and he didn't return that evening or the next day, and I felt a genuine sense of loss that surprised me with its intensity. I removed the camera from the porch and stored it inside, and I continued placing food offerings even though they remained untouched for 3 days. On the 4th morning, I found the plate empty again, but he didn't show himself, and I understood that I'd damaged the trust we'd built and would need to rebuild it slowly and carefully. After crossing a line that couldn't be explained away, could trust ever return, or had I already sealed the outcome? It took nearly 2 weeks before Bigfoot allowed himself to be visible again during the food exchanges, and even then he maintained a greater distance than he had before, watching me with what I interpreted as wariness mixed with something that might have been disappointment. I continued the offerings without any attempt to reintroduce the camera, focusing instead on reestablishing the routine and comfort level we'd achieved before my mistake. And gradually I saw him begin to relax again, his approaches becoming less cautious and his departures less hurried. Summer deepened into the long, warm days of July and August, and I spent more time outside, working in the small garden I'd established near the cabin and performing maintenance tasks that had been postponed during the winter months. Bigfoot watched these activities from his usual position at the tree line, and I grew so accustomed to his presence that I found myself speaking to him regularly, narrating what I was doing or commenting on the weather or simply filling the silence with the sound of my voice. He never responded with vocalizations of his own, but his body language suggested he was listening and processing. One afternoon in late August, I was sitting on the porch steps sorting through old photography equipment, deciding what to keep and what to discard, when I came across a small portable printer I'd used in the field for making quick reference prints. An idea formed in my mind, something that felt both risky and potentially transformative, and I spent the next several days considering how to implement it without triggering another retreat. I decided to start by photographing myself, using the camera's timer function to capture images of me in various locations around the cabin, and then printing these images and displaying them openly where Bigfoot could observe them. Could an image explain intention where words still couldn't? I set up the first series of photos on the porch railing, images of myself standing near the garden, sitting on the steps, holding a plate of food, and I weighted them down with stones so they wouldn't blow away. That evening, when Bigfoot came for the food offering, he noticed the photographs immediately, approaching them with extreme caution and examining them from several angles before actually touching them. He picked up one of the images, holding it carefully between his massive fingers, and he looked from the photograph to me and back again several times, and I could see the moment when understanding registered in his expression. Bigfoot set the photograph down gently and picked up another, repeating the process of comparison and study. And then he looked at me directly with an intensity that made me catch my breath. I pointed to myself and then to the photograph, repeating the gesture several times, and then I picked up the camera and pointed to it, then to myself, then to the resulting image, trying to demonstrate the connection between the device and the representation it created. He watched this entire performance with focused attention, and when I finished, he gathered all the photographs carefully and carried them to the edge of the forest, where he sat down in a patch of fading sunlight and continued examining them for nearly an hour. Over the next week, I repeated this process, creating more photographs of myself and leaving them in various locations around the clearing, and each time he collected them and studied them with the same intense focus. I began including photographs of other subjects as well, images of the forest and the mountains and the animals that passed through the area, building a visual vocabulary that might help him understand what I wanted to eventually ask of him. He seemed to grasp the concept quickly, and I noticed that he began positioning himself more deliberately when he knew I was watching, as if testing whether I might be creating images of him even without the camera visible. If he was already anticipating the lens, how far ahead of me was his understanding? On a cool morning in early September, nearly a full year after our first encounter, I brought the camera out onto the porch again, but this time I held it in my hands rather than simply placing it on the railing. He arrived for the morning offering and stopped when he saw it, but instead of retreating, he remained motionless, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. I pointed to the camera, then to him, then to an empty space on the porch railing where a photograph might be displayed, repeating the sequence several times while speaking softly about what I wanted to do and why it mattered to me. He stood completely still for what felt like an eternity, and I could see the conflict playing out in his posture, the tension between his instinctive fear of the device and his apparent understanding of what I was asking. Finally, he moved slightly, adjusting his position so that he was more fully visible in the morning light, and he looked directly at me with an expression that seemed to communicate both permission and trust. I raised the camera slowly, giving him time to change his mind or retreat, but he remained in place, though I could see his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. But at that time, I had no idea what he would say to me later, or how much this silent agreement would matter when he finally spoke. So why did that look feel like the start of a conversation I couldn't yet hear? I took 3 photographs in quick succession, and then I immediately lowered the camera and set it down on the porch, showing him that the process was complete. When I printed the photographs, I was struck by how clearly they captured not just his physical presence, but something of his personality and intelligence. His eyes in the images held a depth of awareness that was unmistakable, and his posture, even in his obvious discomfort, conveyed a dignity and presence that went far beyond anything I'd expected. I displayed the prints on the porch railing, and when he arrived that evening, he approached them with a mixture of curiosity and what might have been apprehension. Bigfoot picked up the first photograph and stared at it for a long time, bringing it close to his face and then holding it at arm's length. And then he touched his own face with his free hand, his fingers tracing the contours of his features as if confirming that the image truly represented him. He looked at me with an expression of wonder that was so human in its essence that I felt tears forming in my eyes. And he carefully set the photograph down and picked up the next one, repeating the process of examination and self-recognition. He spent nearly 2 hours with those images, studying them from every angle, and when he finally left, he carried one of them with him into the forest, holding it carefully as he disappeared into the shadows. The photography sessions became a regular part of our routine, though I was always careful to limit them and to watch for signs of stress or discomfort. He grew more comfortable with the camera over time, his poses becoming more natural and his reactions to the shutter sound less pronounced. I showed him every image I captured, printing them immediately and allowing him to examine them. I thought we were building trust through images alone, but was he waiting for the right moment to replace pictures with words, and how close was I to hearing the first one? In late October, I introduced the video camera, a small handheld device that I'd used extensively in my professional work for capturing animal behavior in real time. I showed him the camera first. He was fascinated by the movement and sound, leaning in close to the screen and reaching out as if to touch the image of me that moved and spoke within the device. When I asked if I could record him using gestures and the photographs to communicate my request, he agreed with less hesitation than I'd expected, positioning himself near the tree line where the light was good and the background showed the forest he called home. I recorded for only a few minutes that first time, capturing him as he moved slightly from side to side, as he looked around the clearing, as he reached down to touch the ground, and then stood again to his full height. When I played back the footage for him, his reaction was profound and immediate, a sharp intake of breath followed by complete stillness as he watched himself move and exist within the small screen. He reached toward the camera, his finger hovering just above the screen, and he made a sound I'd never heard from him before, a low vocalization that seemed to combine surprise and recognition and something deeper that I couldn't name. He watched the footage 3 times, and each time his focus seemed to intensify, as if he was discovering new aspects of himself in the recorded images. And when I finally turned off the camera, he sat down heavily on the ground, his expression distant and contemplative in a way that suggested he was processing something significant and perhaps overwhelming. The video recordings became more frequent and more extensive, and I began to capture not just his physical presence, but his interactions with the environment. One evening in November, he approached closer to the cabin than he ever had before, coming within 10 feet of where I stood on the porch. I had the video camera running, mounted on a tripod, and recording continuously, and he glanced at it briefly before returning his attention to me. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and I saw his throat working, muscles contracting and releasing as he struggled to produce sounds that his vocal anatomy wasn't designed to create easily. What emerged was rough and broken, syllables that approximated human speech but were distorted by the structure of his mouth and throat, and it took me a moment to recognize that he was attempting to say my name. I'd spoken it countless times in his presence, referring to myself in the third person during my narrations of daily activities, and he'd apparently been listening and learning and waiting for the moment when he felt comfortable enough to try using it himself. The sound he produced was close enough that I understood immediately what he was attempting, and I felt a rush of emotion so strong that I had to sit down on the porch steps to steady myself. What responsibility comes with being named by something the world refuses to believe exists? I responded by speaking his name, Bigfoot, and he tilted his head and repeated it back to me, his version clearer than his attempt at my name had been. We spent the next hour in a halting exchange of words, simple things like yes and no and food and cold. His vocabulary limited to what he'd overheard from me and perhaps from other humans he'd observed from a distance over the years. His grammar was non-existent and his pronunciation was difficult, but the intention and intelligence behind the effort were unmistakable, and I understood that we'd crossed into entirely new territory in our relationship. Over the following years, his speech improved gradually, his vocabulary expanding to include more complex concepts, and his ability to string words together into simple phrases, developing through practice and repetition. He told me in broken fragments that I had to piece together carefully that he'd been injured when he was younger, something about his leg that had healed incorrectly and left him slower than the others of his kind. He communicated through gestures and simple words that his group had left him behind, that their social structure valued strength and speed, and that weakness was not tolerated or accommodated. He'd been alone for many years, he told me, moving through territories that other groups had abandoned or avoided, staying away from humans except to observe them from safe distances. Through the winter months, our conversations deepened and expanded, though they remained limited by his vocabulary and the physical difficulty he experienced in producing human speech sounds. He told me things about his kind that I would never have learned through observation alone, fragments of information that built into a broader understanding of a species that had remained hidden and largely unknown despite sharing the continent with humans for thousands of years. He explained that his people could live for very long periods, that some of the elders in the groups he'd known as a younger individual had been alive for nearly 100 years, their knowledge and memory spanning generations of human activity and environmental change. What secrets survive when a species chooses hiding over extinction? Bigfoot told me that his kind had once been less fearful of humans, that there had been a time in the distant past when limited interaction occurred, when his people and mine had maintained a cautious but not entirely hostile relationship. But firearms had changed everything, he said. The ability of humans to kill from a distance without physical confrontation had made his kind retreat deeper into wilderness areas and adopt strict avoidance behaviors that were now fundamental to their survival. The cameras, he explained haltingly, were almost as feared as guns because his people had learned that being photographed often led to being hunted, that images brought more humans with weapons and traps and intentions that ranged from capture to killing. He'd overcome this fear with me, he said, because the years of consistent peaceful interaction had convinced him that I represented something different. But he made it clear through repeated emphasis that no other human could be trusted with the knowledge of his existence or location. Spring arrived again, marking 7 full years since our first encounter, and I noticed changes in his behavior that I couldn't immediately interpret. When I asked him what was wrong, he struggled to explain, his limited vocabulary inadequate for conveying whatever concern was occupying his thoughts. Bigfoot repeated the word others several times, and he gestured toward the deeper forest with movements that suggested distance and direction. I understood that he was trying to warn me about something, that other members of his kind were approaching or might approach, but I couldn't determine whether this was a normal occurrence or something that worried him specifically. In early May, on a morning that began like dozens of others before it, everything changed in a span of minutes that felt both impossibly fast and horribly slow. I'd placed the morning food offering and had returned to the porch with my video camera, recording as I usually did, when he emerged from the tree line moving faster than normal, his posture conveying urgency and fear. He looked directly at me and vocalized a single word, "Run." And then he turned toward the forest behind him as shapes materialized from the shadows between the trees. There were 4 of them, all larger than him, all moving with a coordinated precision that spoke of planning and purpose, and they ignored me completely as they converged on him from multiple angles. He didn't attempt to flee or fight, instead dropping to a submissive crouch that seemed to be some form of surrender or acknowledgement of their authority. But this didn't stop or even slow their attack. They struck him with closed fists and open palms, blows that landed with sounds like wood striking wood, and he absorbed the punishment without resistance. His only reaction, a series of low vocalizations that might have been words in his own language, or simply expressions of pain. The beating continued for several minutes, systematic and thorough, and when they finally stopped, he was lying motionless on the ground, his breathing labored, and his body showing obvious injuries. The largest one vocalized something, sounds that were clearly language, but in a register and pattern I couldn't begin to interpret, and the others responded by producing lengths of vine and flexible branches that they used to bind his arms and legs, working with a practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd performed such an action. They lifted him between them, 2 supporting his upper body and 2 his lower half, and they began carrying him toward the forest, moving in a direction different from the one they'd arrived from. He turned his head toward me once during this process, and our eyes met across the clearing, and I saw in his expression a complexity of emotions that I couldn't fully parse, but that included resignation and sorrow and perhaps apology. Then they were gone, disappeared into the forest as completely as if they'd never existed, and the clearing was silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the quiet mechanical whir of the camera still recording on its tripod. I stood on the porch for a long time after they'd vanished, my body refusing to move, my mind cycling through the events I'd just witnessed and trying to find some action I could take or response that would make sense. But there was nothing, no authority I could contact without betraying him further. I never saw him again after that morning, and the forest around the cabin became truly empty in a way it hadn't been even before our first encounter. The gifts he'd hidden remained where he'd placed them, slowly deteriorating through exposure to weather and time, and I left them undisturbed as a kind of memorial to what we'd shared. The food offerings I continued to place for weeks afterward were never touched, eventually attracting only conventional wildlife that had no understanding of the ritual's significance or history.